Lida arrived at the hospital in an old Chevrolet that should have been sent to the landfill long ago. The engine was humming, and the headlights dimly illuminated the empty parking lot in front of the building. Autumn had come into its own. The cold air was making its way under a thin jacket. A thin fog was spreading on the asphalt. She got out of the car, turned up the collar of her jacket higher, and stepped towards the entrance. The automatic doors hissed open, letting her in, and the familiar smell of the hospital antiseptic, coffee, bleach overwhelmed her. The shift started quietly. Lida loved night shifts, less fuss, fewer bosses, and her colleagues were different at this time of day. The doctor on shift is a man in his 40s, strong, broad-shouldered, with sharp features, always a little rumpled, as if barely awake. He was one of those people who didn't ask unnecessary questions, but did his job clearly. Lida appreciated it. The receptionist was bored at the reception, flipping through a magazine. Dim lights shone in the hall, and a TV hung on the wall, from where the news was coming softly. Lida glanced at the screen briefly. Something about mass riots, a surge of aggression, some kind of attacks. Rubbish. There is a constant whirl of people and nations in Moscow, and this has not happened before. Capital. The flow of patients was modest. Some homeless man with a broken nose sitting in a corner and burying his face in the floor, as if he already knew that he would receive help only formally. A prostitute who escaped from a pimp was sitting on a couch, rubbing her swollen leg. Lida looked at her with professional indifference. Her short leather skirt was pulled up, revealing thin, scratched legs in torn tights. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her makeup was smudged, as if she hadn't just run away but had also fought before. Her lips were trembling, and her fingers were convulsively clutching the edge of her skirt. The doctor, stretching his neck, sipped from a mug of coffee and glanced at the screen. "God, that's crazy," he grumbled. "The quadrobers, then some other crazy people. Where is the world going?" Lida took the remote control and started switching channels. It was the same everywhere. Emergency broadcasts, alarmed presenters, shots with blurred figures rushing at people. Blood, screams, police sirens. An uneasy feeling prickled in his chest. There was something wrong with that. And then the door slammed open. A guy rushed into the hall, barely able to stand on his feet. One hand was clutching his neck, and blood was gushing from under his fingers. His face was deathly pale, his lips were blue, and in his eyes there was panic, fear, something else, strange, wild. "Help me! Help!" He screamed and collapsed on the tiled floor. Lida darted towards him, but something in his gaze made her freeze for a split second. Pupils dilated, breathing convulsively, but not from pain, from something else. There was something inhuman about his face. Lida was the first to rush to the guy, without thinking, acting on instinct. Slick, warm blood soaked her gloves and trickled through her fingers, but she pressed her palm harder against the wound, trying to slow the flow of blood a little. The guy jerked, gasping for air, wheezing as if he was suffocating. The doctor was already there, dropping heavily to one knee. "Hurry to his office on the table," he barked, brooking no argument. Lida barely had time to pull away when one of the nurses ran up to them, rolling out a couch. The guy was grabbed by the arms and thrown onto a soft surface. He jerked and screamed in pain, but he no longer had the strength to resist. Lida ran next to him, continuing to press on the wound with one hand, holding the guy's shoulder with the other, trying to calm him down somehow. A harsh white light came on in the reception room. The couch was rolled up to the operating table, and the doctor wasted no time in issuing an order. "Lida, a pressure bandage. We need to shut off the blood flow. Push it down. You'll take it away on command." She rushed to the drawer, grabbed a dressing bag, and immediately grabbed the guy's neck just above the wound. She pulled and twisted the knot, quickly checking to make sure she hadn't pushed it too hard. The guy wheezed. His eyes rolled back, pupils twitched to the sides. "Keep your head up," the doctor shouted, bending over the wound. "Put the package away." Lida pressed her palm to his forehead, fixed his chin. The doctor set to work, grabbed an antiseptic, quickly treated the bleeding incision, and examined it. Deep, but not fatal. "It's strange," he muttered. "He shouldn't lose consciousness so quickly." Lida noticed it too. The guy seemed to be slipping away. His breathing became weaker. The wheezing turned into a trembling moan. The doctor took a syringe, quickly filled it with saline solution, stuck the needle into a vein, starting to drip liquid. But then, something changed. The guy's skin, which had been pale before, began to turn gray, as if the blood was being drawn from the inside. Black veins appeared along his neck, along his cheekbones, along his arms, expanding, filling the surface like ink threads. Lida shuddered and took a step back, clutching her bloody gloves convulsively. The guy wasn't moving anymore. He froze, as if his body had turned to stone. The doctor swore, bent down quickly, pressed his fingers to the carotid artery. He was silent for several long seconds, then pulled away with a heavy sigh. "I'm ready," he said shortly. Lida stared at him, disbelief rippling through her like a cold wave. How? He didn't lose that much blood. The doctor shrugged his shoulders, threw his gloves into the wash basin, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The guy jerked with such force that the couch bounced, crashing into the wall. His body arched, his spine cracked as if it was about to break, and then he jerked up, exhaling a long, deep growl. Lida froze. Her fingers clenched on her robe, and her heart jumped into her throat. It was not a scream, not a moan, but something bestial, alien. He lunged forward, grabbing the doctor's sleeve, his fingers gripping the fabric with a strength that a dying man could not have. The doctor cursed, jerked back, but the guy was already trying to get up. "Stay down, bitch," the doctor barked, and grabbing the guy by the shoulders, he forcefully pushed him back onto the couch. The guy arched, wriggling, the muscles in his neck tensed, and his eyes rolled back in his head. The doctor, gritting his teeth, grabbed him by the head and jerked him sharply to the side. There was a deafening crunch, and the guy's neck broke, his head hung sideways at an unnatural angle. But he didn't die. He let out a hoarse, long-drawn growl, and then rushed forward, sinking his teeth into the doctor's face. Lida screamed and rushed to the door. The air felt icy, silhouettes flashed around, but she felt nothing except her own panic. A nurse got in her way, a huge, burly fellow with fists the size of her head. "There! There!" she shouted, pointing into the office. "Help me!" From behind the door came a crash, the crash of falling furniture, and the wild scream of a doctor. "Hey, what are you doing, you bastard?" The nurse silently yanked the door open and rushed inside. At the same moment, he froze. The guy was still standing. His head was hanging to one side, but he was moving. He was breathing. There were bloody patches of skin on his lips. The doctor staggered, clutching his bloody cheek, thick, dark blood oozing from the wound. "Fuck!" the nurse whispered and rushed forward. He grabbed the zombie by the shoulders and pulled it back, but it clung to the doctor with force, not letting go. Together with him, the nurse pulled a piece of meat, tearing it right out of his face. The doctor screamed, loudly, eerily, blood splattered on the white walls. "Get off him, bitch!" the nurse barked, and with superhuman strength pulled the monster back. He fell to the floor, hitting the back of his head, but immediately began to rise. Lida clutched the door handle, her eyes wide, her breathing ragged. "Lock him up!" the nurse barked. The doctor, clutching his bloody face, clenched his teeth, and together with him tore open the door, pushing the monster back into the office. The next second, they slammed it shut and put their shoulders on it. A thud came from inside. Then another one. A crowd had already gathered in the hallway. Nurses, orderlies, even a cleaning lady with a bucket in her hands. Someone crossed themselves convulsively. Someone pressed against the walls, afraid to move. Lida turned to the doctor. He was breathing heavily. His fingers were convulsively clutching his bloody face. Blood was flowing down his white coat. His voice sounded muffled but menacing. "Lock up the hospital! Quickly!" Someone hesitated, but he roared, shouting through the pain. "Call the cops! Now!" The doctor was sitting on a chair, breathing heavily. Blood continued to flow down his cheek, but he did not even wince. Lida quickly opened the package of gauze, pressed it to the wound, looking up at him. She knew that such lacerations required stitches, otherwise the blood would not stop. "We need to sew it up," she said firmly. The doctor just waved it away, trying to ignore the pain. Later. Just put a bandage on it now, he said hoarsely. Lida bit her lip, but obediently began to bandage his face. The doctor lowered his head heavily, clenched his fingers into fists, his chest heaved with tension. There was a tense silence in the room, broken only by the soft sobs of someone from the staff. Suddenly, a thud echoed through the building. Lida shuddered. The doctor raised his head. The entire hospital shift froze, listening intently. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was rhythmic, steady. It was like something heavy was hitting the door with force. The doctor squinted in the direction of the locked office, listened, and then a growl was heard. Lingering, guttural, inhuman. Someone gasped for air. Someone backed away in panic. Lida slowly got to her feet, her fingers clutching at the bandages. "What's going on, you fucking fly?" The doctor swore. His voice trembled with pain, but irritation splashed in his eyes. "It's a madhouse! Turn on the news already!" Someone pulled the remote control, and the TV hanging in the hall came to life. The emergency issue logo immediately flashed on the screen, and the announcer's anxious voice filled the hallway. At that moment, Lenka, the second nurse, entered the office, her hair disheveled, her face pale, and her phone clutched in her hands. She breathed out, looking from the doctor to the TV. "Everything is occupied. They say that the city is a complete nightmare. Attacks, panic. The police are all on call, they don't pick up the phone." The doctor gritted his teeth, wiped the blood from his hand, and looked at the screen. Hell was going on television. The camera was shaking, the reporter was running somewhere, shouting something into the microphone, and behind him you could see the panic. Burning cars, people knocking each other down, heart-rending screams. The footage changed. The police are shooting back at a group of people, but the bullets don't stop them. They fall, but immediately get up, with a mad grin on their faces. Smeared silhouettes, someone's bloody mouth, torn pieces of flesh. So far, the authorities have not given official statements, but according to eyewitnesses, a nightmare has begun on the streets. People are attacking each other. The police are not coping. We saw them being shot at, but they kept attacking. The picture changed dramatically. A man in a white lab coat appeared on the screen, bald, with a wrinkled face, his eyes intense, his lips compressed. Cameramen were bustling behind him. Someone was whispering with the presenter, but he just looked at the camera, as if he was addressing everyone directly. "You have to understand. This is not an ordinary virus. This is something new, uncontrollable. It affects the nervous system, destroys personality, deprives a person of reason. Are you saying that this is a disease? Like rabies?" The presenter looked like he was ready to drop the microphone and run. The scientist ran his hand over his face, hunched over, as if he didn't believe his own words. "No, it's not a disease. It's something else. They're not just aggressive, they lose control, but they keep moving, killing. They bite people and transmit the virus through blood and saliva." Someone in the audience sobbed. "And then what happens to them?" The presenter swallowed. The scientist closed his eyes, then opened them slowly, heavily. After an hour, the bitten person loses consciousness. His body cools down. Then, he stands up. The doctor froze. His hand slowly rose to the bandage on his cheek. His face turned chalk white. The doctor pulled a cigarette out of the pack with trembling fingers, clamped it between his teeth, and took a lighter out of his pocket. He clicked the wheel twice before the flame flared up. Lida watched his fingers tremble, but not from fear, from the realization that he was doomed. He took a deep drag, leaned his head back against the wall, blew out thick smoke, and smiled bitterly. There was a tense silence in the corridor, broken only by the muffled sobs of someone from the medical staff. A door slammed in the distance. Someone ran across the tiles, but no one spoke. Everyone was waiting for the doctor to say something, and Lida looked at him without blinking. My chest felt so tight that it became difficult to breathe, and tears burned my eyes. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She was afraid to say the words, afraid of their very meaning. But I knew I had to ask. The doctor slowly turned his head towards her, looked straight into her eyes. There was no panic in his eyes, no anger. Just fatigue. Deep, impenetrable, heavy as lead. What should I do? Lida was already crying, but not from fear, but from realization. The doctor took another drag, deeper, longer. Then he exhaled smoke, looking at the ceiling, and nodded. It was a short, barely noticeable nod, but Lida understood it without words. His heart was still beating, but not for long. He closed his eyes and ran a hand over his face, as if trying to shake off an obsession. Then he abruptly got up from his chair, pushing him hard with his foot. "Lock me in here," he said calmly. Someone sobbed in the hallway. "Hide everyone in the hemolab," he continued, ignoring her. "There are metal doors they will hold. Lock yourself in and wait for help." Lenka, who had been just standing there, let out a barely audible sob. "Doctor," she began, but he immediately raised his palm, silencing her. "Do a physical examination of everyone," he ordered, and his voice sounded almost distant, as if he wasn't talking about living people, but about the figures in the report. "Any bite marks, even old ones, any lacerations, the slightest hint of possible infection. Refuse." He looked at everyone with a hard look. No doubt about it. The orderly, who was standing closest, swallowed noisily, and then nodded slightly. The doctor turned his gaze to the nurse, a burly man with strong fists. "Check it out. They must survive," he said, and his voice was no longer trembling. "You have a chance. Save yourself." The nurse nodded silently. Lida took a step back, shook her head, and let out a strangled sob, and the banging was still going on outside the door. The crash, the crash, the crash. The monster did not tire. It didn't stop. It was still trying to get out. "Everyone to the hemolab, now!" the nurse barked, grabbing the elbow of the nearest nurse and literally pushing her towards the corridor. The crowd of medical staff buzzed and bustled. People rushed to the laboratory, jostling each other, some gasping in panic, some sobbing. Lida, trying to prevent the chaos from spreading, ran up to the paramedics and sharply shouted, "Stay together! Faster! Faster!" The doctor, breathing heavily, braced his hands against the wall, his lips pressed into a thin line. He no longer paid attention to the pain. He just stood there, listening as they ran away, realizing that he would not go there himself. The crash. The crash. The sound of banging on the door grew stronger, as if the creature behind it sensed movement, energy, and fear. "We'll close the doors when everyone is inside," the nurse shouted. "Hurry up!" The corridor, which seemed to be infinitely long, was flooded with dim lamplight. People huddled together and reached the massive door of the laboratory. It was the only room in the hospital where the doors were not flimsy plastic, but heavy, reinforced metal sheets. "Get everyone inside," the nurse commanded, grabbing Lida by the shoulder. "We check everyone." She nodded, though her hands were shaking. Her eyes frantically ran over the faces of her colleagues. She saw their fear, their hope for a miracle. But there will be no miracle. "Quickly, lift up your sleeves, pants, and look at your arms, legs, and neck." "Stop it!" she shouted. The medical staff began to fuss. One after another, people came into the laboratory, showed their hands, bared their ankles, examined each other. "Clear!" the paramedic's voice rang out. "Clear!" another nurse echoed. But then a man stepped forward. Lida recognized him. The drunk who was brought in a couple of hours ago, bruised face, disheveled shirt, smelly breath. He was holding his shoulder, leaning on his leg. "I just need to fix it," he croaked, staring at Lida. "Fix my shoulder already." "Hands," she said harshly. The drunk slowly took his hand off her shoulder, and Lida felt her stomach tighten. On his forearm, under a layer of dirt and dried blood, there was a laceration, not fresh, but clearly from a bite. The skin around it turned yellow, and the dried blood formed a crust. "Damn," she whispered. The nurse was already there. "What have you got there?" His voice turned icy. The drunk blinked stupidly, raised his hand, as if he had just realized what he was talking about. "Yes, that's bullshit. It's been a long time. I got into a fight yesterday. Let me go, damn it. I need my shoulder fixed." "No," the nurse said coldly. The drunk suddenly realized that he would not be allowed in. "What are you creatures? It's just an old wound." "Stop it!" he yelled, trying to break through. Lida recoiled. The nurse rushed forward, grabbed the drunk by the scruff of the neck and forcefully pushed him back into the corridor. "Let me go, you freaks!" the drunk squealed, sputtering. "Close it!" the nurse barked. The door slammed in his face. The drunk outside howled and started pounding on the metal. "Open up! You bitches, you're fucked up!" An hour later, there were thudding footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, jerky, with a metallic clang, as if people in heavy boots were moving steadily and dispassionately. Their voices were hoarse, tired, but not anxious. They spoke as if they were already used to what was happening. "There are two of them," someone said. "I see," the other replied, looking around. "Alone in the medical room. And some guy's a civilian. This bum is still. Can we roast everything with flamethrowers?" Lida shuddered. Her heart sank down and then soared back up, beating in furious panic. They were talking about being locked in the hallway, about the doctor, about the drunk who wasn't allowed in. She pressed herself against the cold metal of the door, and then began pounding on it with her fists, painfully knocking off her knuckles. "Hey, we're here! We're normal! Help!" A sharp, authoritative voice rang out from behind the door. "Stop! Don't open the door!" She held her breath, feeling an icy fear slash down her spine. "Who are you and how many of you are?" they shouted from the corridor. Lida spoke hurriedly, afraid to miss even a second. "We are the hospital staff." Her voice trailed off, and she caught her breath. "There are 6 of us and 3 patients. We are not infected. We are fine." There was silence. Outside the door, someone was discussing something briefly, in a whisper. Then they said hoarsely, "Who the hell knows?" They also said in Torgash that they were normal. And then it started. Lida felt her stomach turn cold. What kind of huckster? It flashed through my mind, but that wasn't what mattered. The important thing was that these people had already seen this, and they didn't believe anyone. Damn, she muttered, backing away. Suddenly the air began to change. The heat came in waves, becoming unbearable. Lida backed away from the door, gasping, her lungs already filling with smoke. The smell of burnt flesh, melting plastic, molten metal ate into the skin, into the hair, into the very air. The nurse looked around in panic, but there was no way out. The laboratory, which was supposed to be a shelter, was turning into a furnace. The walls began to heat up, the glass on the cabinets became cracked, and wires sparked in the corners. Someone started coughing, clutching at his throat, and the air inside became thin. Lida bit her lip until it bled. Her fingers clenched into fists, panic suffocated. But what could be done? The military didn't even listen, didn't even try to check. They just cleared the building, wiped it off the face of the earth. The hissing became deafening, and the flames outside the door flared up with renewed vigor. The oxygen was burning, and the fire consumed everything in its path, turning the room into a red-hot trap. The metal of the door began to bend, deform, and the first creepy dark spots appeared in the walls. Lida covered her mouth with her hands, but the smell of death was everywhere, soaking into her skin, hair, and lungs. The nurse standing closest to the door suddenly screamed, jerked her hand away and screamed. There was a terrible burn on her palm. Her skin was covered with blisters, and the pain cut through her scream, drowning out everything. Panic broke out instantly. Someone screamed. Someone rushed to a corner, in the vain hope of hiding, but there was no escape. They were all waiting for only one thing, when the fire would consume them completely, burn everything out, leaving behind only ashes. Lida turned around, her eyes burning with heat and tears, but she was still trying to think of something. The nurse gritted his teeth and rushed to the cabinets, knocking them over in desperation, as if hoping to find something that would help. Someone started to pray. Someone started coughing, choking, unable to speak anymore. The temperature was rising by the second. The smell of burning meat appeared in the air, and Lida realized that they were burning. She closed her eyes, clutched her robe convulsively. Her thoughts flitted between fear and hatred. They shouldn't have died like this. They were human beings. They were alive, but for those outside they were already considered dead.